Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. The debate over what kind of legal recognition should be given to transsexual individuals continues unabated. 38% of American adults say they think we've gone too far in accepting transgender people, while 36% say we've not gone far enough. Paisley Currah, a professor of political science and women's and gender studies at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, has an interesting take on why the government has a stake in defining people's sexual identity. It has less to do with moral or religious beliefs about sexuality, he argues, and more to do with deciding who does or doesn't get certain benefits. But is even that changing? His new book, Sex Is as Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity, is published by New York University Press. Welcome.
Thank you.
Over the last few decades, the variety of gender identities that the public has been exposed to has expanded greatly. While once people were either male or female, gay or lesbian, or straight or bisexual, now you can be a transgender male, a transgender female, cisgender, binary, non-binary. I even read that there are actually more than 70 acknowledged gender categories aside from male and female. Do you understand why some people are confused by all of this?
Oh, for sure, because we think of, when we grow up, we're told there's like two genders or two sexes, male and female, and that's just kind of the long-standing kind of common sense wisdom. But that common sense wisdom doesn't really reflect how people inhabit gender or live with their gender, and there's been this kind of flourishing of language and thought and discourse about gender that gives people more finely tuned language to express who they really are. So now, the very common categories are male, female, and non-binary. And so non-binary is sometimes emerging as a kind of catch-all category for people who don't fit, whose gender identity is not always male or not always female, but is sometimes in between.
Your book looks specifically at how the state, meaning different government agencies, legislatures, the courts, classify people by gender, or allows people to classify themselves by gender. What did you hope to achieve by writing this book?
Well, I had been working in the area of transgender rights for, a couple of decades. I had been a transgender rights advocate and, doing transgender studies, and I founded a transgender studies journal and worked at the city and the state and the federal level to pass trans rights legislation. And then I decided I wanted to step back a little bit and just figure out at a more deeper level what's going on. So the problem that really interested me was this situation where someone like me, a transgender person, a transgender man, I might have an M for male on my driver's license, but be classified as an F for marriage or be sent to a women's prison. So I was trying to understand, how could the government classify people differently? Say
different agencies, different
and it turns
government
out,
energy.
Right, exactly. So from a transgender person's perspective, that's unfair and unjust, which is true. But I wanted to kind of understand from the state's perspective, why do they have these different criteria for deciding who's male and who's female?
Why the title, Sex Is as Sex Does?
That's a good question. So as an advocate, I spent a lot of time saying, talking with New York City officials or state officials about how to classify people's gender. And we'd say gender should really be based on, gender identity. And this is the ideal definition of gender, and one's sexual characteristics kind of fall under the category of gender. So we were always arguing about some ideal, perfect definition, which is important to talk about. But over time, I realized the bureaucrats weren't thinking about some ideal, perfect definition of what sex really is. They were thinking about what it does, how it functions in government. So sex is different in incarceration institutions than in marriage and in driver's license bureaus.
How it's used is different.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Thinking of the practicalities, and we'll come back to that. Lately, there's been a flurry of state legislation aimed at prohibiting trans people from, accessing public restrooms that don't correspond to their assigned sex, gender at birth, banning trans students from participating in sports aligned with their gender identities, outlawing classroom discussions of gender and sexual identity altogether. Why is this happening now?
Right, I think that's a really good question, because what most of my book talks about is how sex classification was kind of the domain of bureaucrats, and now sex classification and transgender issues have been kind of punted into the overt political sphere where legislators are talking about it. In previous decades, legislators would have no idea what was going on in their government in terms of sex classification, and now they really are paying attention. And I think that gender is being sort of weaponized in the cultural wars to stoke the base, because you mentioned in your introduction that there's a significant element of the population that is against transgender people or transgender rights. And what some people who study public opinion have found is like public opinion was getting better and better and better on transgender rights, and now it's diverging. It's becoming more partisan, and that is a result of Republican messaging around transgender people as being some sort of threat to the nation.
Sort of a political backlash.
It's a backlash.
Right.
Yeah.
A major goal of transgender activism is to allow changes to government identification documents to conform to a person's current gender identity. So what kinds of documents are we talking about, and why is being able to change them so important?
Yeah, it's really important to kind of function in society. Like about 20 years ago, a trans woman testified at a New York City Council hearing about a trans rights bill that I had helped author. And she had the most perfect quote. She said, "I don't suffer from gender dysphoria. I suffer from bureaucratic dysphoria. Every time I try to write a check or present my ID, my identity does not match my appearance, and I'm like stopped in doing what I want to do." So whether it be getting a plane ticket, going through security, the TSA, applying for a loan, all these kind of things, like your identity documents like list your gender, and it becomes a problem for transgender people who don't have an accurate representation of that.
In fact, having an accurate document is a basic condition of doing politics, of being out in the world.
Absolutely.
In New York City, there's obviously been a movement towards some greater acceptance of transgender people, and towards making it easier to legally change one's gender identity on government documents. In New York City, 20 years ago, for instance, a person who wanted to change the gender on their birth certificate had to go through all these things, show they had undergone hormone therapy, gender assignment surgery, a psychiatric examination, affidavits from doctors. Now, all they have to do is to submit their own affidavit indicating that they are either F, M, or X. But you can't do that in most other states, right?
Well, a lot of states are changing their policies. So that's where birth certificates. New York State has also changed its policies around driver's license. So almost all states, all driver's license and almost all states would let people change their sex classification, but many put up barriers that are real obstacles for people in terms of requiring certain kinds of surgeries that a lot of transgender people don't have. So, but now we're seeing a little bit of a division between what we might think of as like red states and blue states, where liberal jurisdictions, progressive jurisdictions say, yeah, you can change your gender classification, that's not a problem. And more redder states are more likely to have more barriers. And this is more of a recent phenomenon in terms of making it more difficult.
Yeah. Tell me about birth certificates in particular, and what states are doing in regard to that.
Yeah, so for a long time there has been a lot of move towards reforming birth certificates. So like, for example, New York City, which for some historical reason is its own jurisdiction for birth certificates. Normally they're state documents.
Right.
New York City is special and New York State does the rest of it. Has changed its policy many times in the last 50 years, and now we have this policy where, yeah, as you said, you just say M or F or X, and that's moving forward. And many states have moved towards that policy. It's super important, but there are some states that, as reform was beginning to happen, transgender issues became politicized, and that has sort of ground to a halt. Like the bureaucrats in the state offices that are working on making life easier for transgender people, we're changing these policies, and now we have something like the legislature of Oklahoma passing a law that says no one in Oklahoma will ever have an X on their birth certificate. And this never used to be the domain of legislators.
Yeah.
They would just leave that to the experts in their administration and not politicize transgender people's identity.
Right. As we said earlier, the state's interest in maintaining certain gender classification it's partly a function of some religious beliefs and some moral beliefs, but it's also done for practical reasons. And I think you wrote that the establishment of gender is a mechanism for distributing rights and resources. In other words, designating some citizens male and others females allows the government to bestow rights and resources on some and not on others. And I mean, I was thinking it basically has been used to discriminate between men and women, sometimes for good purposes, sometimes for negative purposes. That seems to be, that was the major revelation that I got from your book, that it's about, you know, letting states do what they want to do, or state agencies do what they are charged with doing.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important question, because transgender rights movement kind of presents itself as like this autonomous identity politics movement. Like, first there's a civil rights movement, then there's feminism, there's gay rights and transgender rights movement. But in fact, the gains of the transgender rights movement are really related to the gains of feminism. So as feminists fought to stop the state from discriminating against women, the lowering of the ending state discrimination against women has kind of lowered the stakes and made it more possible for transgender people to change their birth certificates, because sex classification is baked into government, not to hurt transgender people intentionally, but to make sure men got more stuff than women most of the time. I mean, selective service is one disadvantage for men. And so transgender people come along and accidentally bump into that system that doesn't really fit who we are. But the more gains that feminism made, the more possibilities there were for transgender people to change our sex classification.
Talk about how some of the different state agencies use, different ways that they use gender classification. I mean, it would be different. There's, you know, the health department with birth certificates. Department of Motor Vehicles probably would have a different motivation. Divorce courts might have a different motivation. Public housing, immigration.
Sure, exactly. So when I was working on the birth certificate policy in New York City in the early part of the 20th century, we thought we could just change the birth certificate policy to a good policy. But the Department of Health shopped it around to all the other city agencies, and every agency had a different take on what the proper definition of sex was. So that's when I started to kind of really think through the major ideas for this book and realize that, like, the Department of Motor Vehicles in New York State, for example, has a pretty good policy. And I, as an activist and an advocate, I think, oh, that's good. They're not being transphobic. They're not hating on transgender people. But in fact, their policy exists because it furthers the state interests. So if I'm a transgender man and I'm getting pulled over by a police officer, it doesn't further the interest of New York State for me to hand over an identity document that says M or F on it. You know what I mean? Because I just don't look like an F. So in terms of the state's interest in kind of keeping track of bodies moving through territory and having an identity card that looks like you, it's in the state's interest to make it possible for me to change my sex classification. Right. But then I would be looking at other areas, and for example, marriage was a big one before, when there was still a ban on same-sex marriage. And transgender people who had changed all their identity documents, still for the purposes of marriage, when it was challenged in the courts would say, oh, your sex is assigned at birth, literally. And it was always because it was in the state's interest to deny access to resources to trans people. So, because marriage isn't just a romantic institution, it's about the distribution of benefits.
Right.
So property cases, custody cases, whether there was a woman in Texas named Christine Lee Littleton, her husband died in a hospital, she wanted to sue the hospital for malpractice, and the hospital's insurance lawyers said, oh wait, she's a trans woman, therefore she was assigned male at birth, therefore she still is a man, therefore her marriage is a same-sex marriage, therefore it's not a valid legal marriage, therefore she has no right to sue. Yeah. So when money's involved, it often went against transgender people.
Driver's licenses in New York. What can you...
Oh, driver's license in New York, you can basically say you're M, you're F, or X. Okay. And that was changed a couple of years ago with legislation. So that's it's one of the best policies. I think there's like 18 or 20 jurisdictions that let people have X on their driver's license.
What does
now.
X mean?
X means non-binary.
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
M, F, or X, yeah.
You argue that it should not be the state's business to police the relationship between people's sex assigned at birth, their gender identity, and gender expression.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is traditionally what has happened. Like going back to like cross-dressing laws and dress codes laws, where like people had to wear a certain number of articles of the clothing associated with their sex, or there has
really?
always Yes, yes. People would get arrested for cross-dressing if they're not wearing like at least three, like someone who was assigned male at birth had to be wearing at least 3 items of men's clothing. So there's lots of really good historical work on cross-dressing laws. So there's always been this regulation of sex and the relationship between assigned sex at birth and one's gender presentation. And now we're moving into an era where that is really much less policed. But with the new Republican kind of weaponization of transgender issues, we're seeing that come back into play, where legislators in like Florida and other places are saying, you know, school kids can't just change their pronoun, or school kids can't just change their name, or school kids have to wear clothes associated with their sex assigned at birth. They're going back into kind of policing gender.
What impact did the Supreme Court's decision in 2015 legalizing marriage between people of same sex have on liberalizing gender classifications?
Yeah, that was a huge win for transgender people, even though people didn't see it that way, because it just looks like a case saying there could be no ban on same-sex marriage. But when doing policy work, a lot of times policymakers would say, well, we don't want to make the criteria for changing your sex too easy, because we don't want people who are like, we don't want to like a cisgender lesbian marrying another cisgender lesbian, and one of them just says, oh, I'm a trans man, and getting married. So they wanted to make sure it was so really difficult to change your sex classification, because there was this institution of opposite sex marriage. And when that was taken away, when that was found to be unconstitutional, that really lowered the barriers for a lot of transgender people.
There's a huge controversy going on right now over whether, in the whole field of athletics, over whether transgender, particularly over whether transgender female athletes should be allowed to compete with other female athletes. Should they? What do you think?
Well, I think the answer should be like, it depends. So for example, we see this incredible overreach, like in the state of Utah, they passed a bill that said trans girls couldn't play on girls' teams. And the governor, a Republican, vetoed the bill. And his veto speech was amazing. He said, this is really an insane bill. We have 75,000 high school students in Utah playing high school sports. We have one transgender girl. No one has complained about that transgender girl. We have an entire legislation passing this bill for one student. He says, never has there been so much ire directed at so few. So, and then we've already seen in Utah since that time where students, the parents of students who come in second and third in competitions are requesting that the gender of the winner be examined. And so these winners are just cis girls, and their gender goes, their school records are being examined back to kindergarten to see if they always were a girl. So it becomes discriminatory towards transgender people, but it also has this effect of like saying to kids, oh, your gender might be investigated if you win this competition. And like, of course, if they're cisgender, they have no problem, but tell that to a 13-year-old girl. What 13-year-old girl wants state officials looking through her school records and her doctor's exams?
There's also a big issue, big controversy in the Olympics about whether women athletes who have, I'm going to say, abnormal amounts of testosterone should be allowed to compete with other female athletes.
Right, and so the International Olympic Committee had a couple of years ago, or maybe a year ago, released a framework saying every sport will come up with its own recommendations or its own rules about who can participate. Their framework was like, it has to be fair, it has to be inclusive, it has to promote competition, all these kinds of things that were perfectly fine. And the idea would be that like, if someone has an advantage because they went through male puberty or because they have high testosterone levels, then that's something that needs to be looked at so we can make sure it's fair. But there's this assumption that someone who's been on hormone therapy still has some kind of advantage, and like that assumption is based on some gender ideology. But I just wrote a piece in Nature actually, just suggesting that like these assumptions actually need to be based on science and data and studies, and we need to compare cisgender women with transgender women and to see like if there really is an advantage or if there's not an advantage. It might change with each sport.
Yeah. According to a recent New York Times article, someone wrote that guidelines regarding transgender athletes represents sports' unsolvable problem. It's certainly complex, right?
It is a complex problem, and like and sports often play this outsized role, and like a lot of anxieties about other things outside of sports come into play in it. So we see like with sports and the anxieties around transgender people, what actually happens is like women who are often from the global south, whose norms of femininity don't match white norms of femininity, suddenly find their gender being investigated. So like, it's not really just a trans issue, it becomes an issue of like, what is too muscular? The New York Times, lovely paper that it is, a few years ago published an article about Serena Williams saying that she was too muscular, like quoting all these tennis players saying, oh, she's too muscular, she's too masculine. Like they were even kind of like throwing these kind of white gender norms on Serena Williams in a, you know, subtly racist way.
The whole issue of gender identity in sports, that's going to be a really thorny issue for a long time, I think.
It is.
Got a lot to work out.
It is, and people need to kind of step back and think of like, what's happening with sports? Are we talking about a 12-year-old playing intramural volleyball? Because that's a different question than elite competition. And we don't need the same rules governing elite competition saying that this 12-year-old kid can't play intramural volleyball. I think because people are so anxious around gender, they take the standards for like Olympic competition and they kind of put them, like with the state of Utah, put them on like kids who want to bat a tennis ball around with their friend. Like it just is overreach in a lot of cases.
Tell me about your experience as a transgender man over time and what that was like, and if you feel things have gotten better.
Well, I feel like, yes, things have definitely gotten better. And, you know, I live in New York City. I live in New York State. So I teach at the City University of New York. I have tenure. I'm a full professor. I'm white. I'm upper middle class. I have almost, and I'm binary looking. People think I'm cisgender. I have my baldness, which seems to establish my maleness. So I have all those kinds of privileges, and even with all those kinds of privileges, I still kind of get nervous, you know, when I go fly, and I have to go through the scanner machines. So if you think about like someone like me moving through the world without that kind of privilege, and then take away that privilege and think about folks who are often assumed to be suspect because they don't have the same kind of class status or because of kind of racialized norms of surveilling people in stores and so on. Like it puts trans people in a very kind of vulnerable position. But I've certainly seen a lot of changes to the positive in New York State. I think I started the book with a story like 20 years ago where in a Toys R Us, which is now defunct, out in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, like 3 trans women were literally chased out of the store by employees wielding baseball bats because their very presence in the store was just considered insane. And now we wouldn't have a retailer supporting that kind of treatment of transgender customers.
It might still happen, but
yeah.
but
they wouldn't go to court defending it to the death. That's right.
Yeah. You suggest, perhaps hypothetically, perhaps not, that no newborn should have a sex marker on their birth certification, that the sex marker would be added later when the child was old enough to have and know his or her sexual identity, or there would be no sex designation for anyone. And my question is, do you really believe this? And do you believe it could ever happen?
Well, I believe that it should happen, and I think it could happen. But the thing is, we have to ask, like, what's the purpose of sex on a document? Certainly, it makes sense, as public health officials had argued, to record the number of people assigned male and people assigned female are born, to kind of for demographic public health purposes. But like, you don't need a sex classification anymore to get married. You don't need it to, you know, become a lawyer or go to a certain kind of school. The only place where it still matters is selective service, and that's, you know, something that probably needs to be thought out. But like, what's the purpose of it when, in fact, the classification that babies are assigned might not match their gender identity later? So.
We've got about 3 minutes left. What do you see as the most pressing issues facing transgenders right now, the most important to you?
Well, I think it's really important to fight back in these red states, the kind of legislation that's going on, like denying gender affirmative care to trans youth, the sports bills and all that. But one of the things I point out in the book is like focusing on transgender specific policies means that we miss out on the larger picture. Because the 3 policies that would help the most transgender people the most would be passing a national public payer health care plan, doing much to get rid of the vast income inequality, and moving towards prison abolition. So transgender people are not just not thriving in red states, they're also not thriving under the normal conditions of capitalism and income inequality. So I do think the struggle for transgender people is connected to larger struggles for social justice.
Prison abolition, that's an interesting one.
Well,
Why
a lot of trans people end up in prison because they're locked out of the employment market, and so they end up becoming vulnerable to police surveillance or participating in activities that are not legal. So prison abolition is certainly on the agenda for transgender rights.
And you've also said that having non-discrimination laws for trans people is not enough. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, this is where I kind of take my cue from feminism and the civil rights movement in terms of the limits of legal reform, because we know that it's not legal to discriminate on the basis of race or gender in employment. But if we look at the corporate world and look at the pictures of board members and CEOs, we see a lot of white men.
It's also not legal to discriminate against trans people in terms of employment.
Now, that changed, yeah. Yes, as of 2019, there was a Supreme Court decision, right. But if you actually look at who governs America, you know, in corporate culture and so on, it's still largely like cisgender white men. So that just points to the limits of legal reform.
Okay, because you have the laws, but people don't necessarily.
Well, they don't write down in a memo, we're not going to hire this type of person, but there's still a culture of like who gets mentored and who doesn't.
Right, right. What do you want people to take away from your book?
Well, I'd like them to kind of see how the book shows how the struggles of trans people are deeply connected with other struggles around income inequality, around feminism, and that it's not just a single issue politics, that it's all these kinds of divisions are kind of woven together.
Sort of, what do they call it, transsectionalism? What is it?
Intersectionality, exactly.
Intersectionality,
yeah.
Right. Well, it's a very interesting issue, and it's also really a hot issue right now.
It is, it is.
So thank you for making it a little more clear for all of us. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Paisley Currah, the author of Sex Is As Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Twitter at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.